Let's talk about endangered species. Now, endangered species are any species of animal that is at risk of extinction. This could be because of loss of critical habitat or a sudden decrease in its population. And if you look on the right, we have levels of endangerment. So we have not evaluated, data deficient, least concerned, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and extinct. So these animals that are on some sort of level of going towards extinct, we want to make sure to protect. And how we protect them is actually from the 1973 Endangered Species Act. And what this act, this new law was designed for was protect those habitats that might have been destroyed from growing cities without that concern for conservation, without preserving those different species. It also prohibits taking, exporting exotic species and selling and transporting those endangered or threatened species, and then designates habitats that are critical for those particular species and prohibits the destruction of that habitat. Now, how are they added to this endangered species list? There are around 700 animals and 900 plant species that are currently listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This was as of May 2022. There are 5 factors that are considered whenever they're looking at each animal individually. So if they need Endangered Species Act protection, they look at habitat decline, overfishing or overhunting, population numbers, any diseases that are getting out of hand, inadequate government regulation, and then other man-made or natural disasters that could impact the existence of that species. Now, it's not quite as straightforward as this species is endangered and this species is threatened, because the conservation status varies by population. So we have different types of populations. The first is residential. That would be a group of animals that stays in one habitat their entire life. So, for example, our bottlenose dolphins that stay in the Galveston Ship Channel and around Galveston Island, those are residential. They're here all year long. They don't migrate anywhere. Migratory species means a group that migrates from one location to another, and that could be following a food source or based on weather patterns. So a great example to this would be gray whale migration. They migrate to Central and South America in order to stay in the warmer waters during the winter, and whenever the summer starts, they go up towards the glaciers in Alaska to be able to grab their food source. So that's a migratory species. They move from one place to another based on food sources or weather patterns, or both. The next is transient species. Now, we have transient species of orcas. Not very many people know that, but we have a species of orca, or a group of orcas that are transient. They don't live here year-round. You never know when they're going to come in and come out, because they're following food, their weather patterns, and there's not really one particular area that they're going to occupy during one time. But they're following those different food sources, and then it also includes if there's dispersal from adjacent habitat. So if one animal is disrupted their environment and they need to move quickly based on those different factors, then that's also called a transient. So transient, less predictable. So like I said, the population type does actually matter. If you look at our protected status of endangered species, you can look, or endangered sea turtles for the green sea turtle. You can see they're endangered in the Central and South Pacific, as well as the Mediterranean Sea. But their status changes to threatened in Central North Pacific, East Pacific, North Atlantic, South Atlantic, and then in our foreign waters, East Indian, West Pacific, North Indian, Southwest Pacific. So they can be endangered or threatened depending on the area that they're living in. And they're looking at those 5 factors, that habitat decline, overfishing, it changes by location. So those green sea turtles need to change their conservation status, so different populations can receive different treatment based on what they need for their habitat. So it is very useful. Now, what is the cause of extinction or to be endangered? The first is natural disasters. So, of course, we know our dinosaurs. There was a meteor strike, and it made dinosaurs become extinct. We also have climate change. You can see with polar bears. Polar bears are a threatened species, and because of global warming, they're losing their habitat. So that's their biggest factor. There's also diseases. Bats suffer from white nose syndrome, and it has really affected their population. And so that's one example for diseases. Also, loss of habitat. In 2013, the Formosan cloud leopard became extinct because their habitat was completely wiped out. Another that's a little bit surprising is lack of genetic diversity. This affects narwhals and sea turtles. They are both on the endangered species list because not just this, but other factors, but they do have a lack of genetic diversity. They have a small population, and this has led them to not have that genetic diversity for them to be able to thrive. The next is better adapted competition. Now, I can see this in my backyard. Brown anole versus green anole. Ding, ding, ding. The green anole is our native species of lizard here, and they're quite beautiful, and they live in everyone's backyard. So if you're in Galveston or southern Texas, you probably have seen a green anole in your life. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but in my backyard, the green anoles I haven't seen as much as I've seen brown anoles. Now, I found out by doing a little bit of research, the brown anole is native to Central and South America, and they were brought over to the U.S. as pets and released thinking that they would survive, and they did, and they are actually outcompeting the green anoles. So they're actually moving those green anoles to the treetops. They're changing their habitat because of the competition. They eat the same thing, and the brown anole is a little bit more successful than the green anole. So it's kind of cool that we get to see that that competition even in our backyards here in southern Texas. Another example of competition is poaching. For us as humans, we have learned to use weapons, and that has made our elephant, rhino, tiger, lemur, gorilla populations to be really vulnerable because of all the hunting. And one that, of course, we always think of is pollution. And our coastal seabirds are highly affected by pollution because they see those bright colors and they see those objects and they think they're food. So let's talk about nature. So how does a habitat structure work? We have native species that are basically they are there as a result of natural evolution, which means that they are the OGs, they are the original gangsters of that environment. They are the ones who helped thrive there, and they are indigenous to that ecosystem. Then there's also an introduced species, and this usually is an impact of humans, either deliberately or accidentally. For example, ballast water. When ships go into port, they take in, or in leave port, they take in and expel water. And a lot of times, a lot of the animals, especially in the ocean, will be taken in and transported to a new place. So that's an introduced species, an exotic or non-native species that was taken from its native range to an outside range, but is still being able to survive. When it becomes an invasive species, that is a species that can cause substantial environmental damage. So that's an introduced species that has come into the environment, and it has had some sort of impact, either ecological, environmental, or economic. So that a good example is a zebra mussel. Zebra mussels are a very hardy species, and what they would do is they cling on to the boats that would be in different rivers or lakes in the United States. They'd cling on and be able to survive until the next drop-off location, and then they'd go to different lakes all across the United States. And because of this, they're easily adapted, and they survive, and they're kind of out-competing different animals in their environment. We also have to mention fire ants and mosquitoes. They definitely cause a personal damage. I do not like fire ants or mosquitoes, and they are here, and they have invaded our area. So those are invasive species. An endemic species is a species that's found in one part of the world, so it's very restricted in its populations in one local area. So an example of this is marine iguanas. They are found in the Galapagos Islands, and that is the only place you'll find those specific iguanas. A keystone species is a species on which the entire food chain, food web depends. So if that one particular animal is taken out of the food chain or food web, the entire ecosystem would change drastically. And a good example of this is sea otters and sea urchins and their kelp food chain. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that effect. So the biggest effect of population decline or extinction is on the world's food chain. So you can see on the food chain on the right, a food chain outlines who eats who. So we have the predator, small fish, larvae, zooplankton, and phytoplankton. That is the food chain. A food web on the left depicts the energy transfer. So it depicts all the food chains in an ecosystem and where that energy is transferred to. So you have the plankton. The krill eats the plankton. That energy is transferred to the krill, which transfers energy to the seal, squid, and seagull and whale. And then if we go to the squid provides energy for seals and seagulls. And then the penguin, it provides energy to the seal. So there's different energy transfers that you can see in that ecosystem. And what can happen if we take one of those organisms out of there? You can have an unbalanced food chain. Now, you can see this example on the animation to the left for sea otters. Now, sea otters' diet is a wide range, but they do eat and maintain the population for sea urchins. These purple sea urchins eat kelp. And with the sea otters present, you can see that the sea otters are maintaining a healthy population of sea urchins. Without the sea otters, that kelp is going to be eaten by all the sea urchins, and they're no longer going to be able to see that kelp. You can see it with a real-world example to the right. With sea otters, you see a blooming kelp forest of elk kelp, and without, all those sea urchins have started decimating that kelp forest. And so you can see that direct link of the keystone species without them can have a drastic impact. Now let's talk about some endangered species, and these are all critically endangered animals in their stories. And as we learn a little bit about each species, I want you to kind of think about key similarities. So what are some things that are similar in each grouping of animals, and what do you think is possibly the cause or one of those reasons? So looking at similarities and then also causes here. The first is the vaquita. Now, the vaquita is the smallest and most endangered cetacean in the world. They are super cute, super tiny, and known as a little cow. And a cetacean means a type of toothed whale. In 2022, there's estimated around 10 individuals remaining in their wild population. Now, in 1997, if you look at the chart above, there's 567, all the way down to 219, 6 to 9. So there has been a drastic decrease in their populations. If you look down to the map at the bottom, you'll see their range, their small population just off the coast of Mexico. Now, because they are in such a small area and it's one place, we call that endemic. So that is an endemic species. It lives in one local area. And their threat is fishery bycatch. Now, in a fishery, if you are fishing for, let's say we're fishing for shrimp, like our shrimping industry in Galveston. If you're a shrimper, then you are fishing for shrimp and you are selling shrimp. Anything else that you catch is called bycatch, and these are things that you can't sell that get stuck in the net and that are not going to be used. So it's basically wasteful fish. And because of the fishing industry, the fishermen were using gill nets, and gill nets are really good nets. I mean, they're just way too good. You actually have to have permits in the United States in order to use these type of nets because they're just way too good. What they do is they catch onto the gills of fish and they're not able to get free. And so these fishermen are trying to get tatuaba fish, which is a high demand in China, and they want the swim bladder. And fishermen can receive $4,000 for each pound of tatuaba swim bladder. So this is illegal. It is not legal to fish, but there is a high incentive, $4,000 for each pound of tatuaba swim bladder. There is still an incentive. So although there has been laws and regulations in place, there hasn't been there hasn't given the vaquita time to be able to regain its population, and there hasn't been stopping of this illegal fishing. The next is the red wolf, and I know this isn't a marine mammal, but I do like to mention this because there is a connection with Galveston. Now, red wolves had a range that extended all the way from Texas to New York. You can see the historical range outlined in the dotted line across the United States in the picture down at the left corner. And the founding source of population was on the Texas-Louisiana coast. Now, there is only one wild population that remains, and that's in eastern North Carolina. But it's kind of cool. Recently, scientists have discovered red wolf DNA in the Galveston coyotes, and that's because we have geographic isolation here. I know we have connections onto the mainland from our little island via the causeway, but there's not a lot of movement from those coyotes from their natural their habitat, their range, right? And they have their little territories in the Galveston area. And because of this geographic isolation, they were able to regain that DNA of red wolves. And in the early 20th century, red wolf populations were decimated because a lot of people thought that they were trying to, and they probably were, they were killing off the wildlife that they were farming. Sorry, they're like if there were sheep or any chickens and things like that, they were wanting to have predator control programs so that their farmed animals were not being killed by wolves and some of those predators that are around. And because of that, they lost their habitat. They didn't have anywhere for them to go. And with that loss of habitat, they didn't really have anywhere that they could reproduce and settle. And so that's why there's only one more population that remains, and that is in eastern North Carolina. Angel sharks are bottom-dwelling sharks. This is a very specific one that lives in the Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea. But this shark species stays on the bottom and is an ambush predator. So they're really good at camouflaging. They'll stay in the bottom. And we call it the scuba diver's nightmare, because if you're going night diving and you don't see an angel shark, you can get bit. But they are very good at ambush predators. They hide really well and disguise themselves very well in the bottom. Now, their population has decreased more than 80% in the past century because of fishing gear that drags across the bottom. And their population has decreased more than 80% during the past 100 years because of this type of fishing gear. You can see their range is quite small. At the bottom where they live, they do kind of venture out a little bit, but they have a very particular range outlined in green. The next is the North Atlantic right whale. Now, the North Atlantic right whale is called the right whale because it is considered the right whale to hunt. That's what the whalers used to call them, because they swam slow, they floated whenever they died, and they have a ton of oil and baleen, and that's what they were using for selling. Now, right whales have been hunted to near extinction, but hunting was banned in 1935. They have a migration route. You can see where they have the calving grounds and their feeding grounds and the different seasons that they migrate in. And they have a range in North America as well as the European continents as well as Iceland. And they're no longer hunted, but they haven't been able to recover their population because of injury due to ship strikes and then also entanglements from different marine debris. The next is the hawksbill sea turtle. Hawksbill sea turtles are native to Gulf of Mexico, and they're named after their hawk-like beak. These guys eat sea sponges in those hard-to-reach crevices in the ocean, and their decline has several different factors. Now, you can notice they have a very large range. They live all over the world, and they are hunted for meat, eggs, shells. Their shell is hunted for jewelry and hair decorations, and they were distributed on international trade. They also experience a lot of habitat loss. They primarily live in coral reefs, and they've seen a lot of habitat loss, and then also pollution. Sea turtles eat anything. So there's a couple factors here that have reduced their population size. And another really big one is there's been a lot of coastal development and what's called beach armoring. And this means that people are making structures that prevent erosion from tropical storms, hurricanes, waves, and current action. And so because of all these factors, they are on the critically endangered list for those species. Now that we talked about them, let's stop and think about it a little bit. What are some of the themes that we saw from these critically endangered species? So one of the things that I saw is a lot of them had a small range, habitat reduction, and were impacted by humans because of either hunting or hunting them just for sport or hunting them for their diet, or hunting their diet in general. The next is you can pause and think about it, but what are some ways that you could help? What are some ways that we as future scientists and as individuals could help these populations? The next question I have is, what are scientists doing to help right now? And I actually have some success stories that I'm going to show you guys from scientific intervention that have really helped the population of some of those species that we had not a lot of hope for. So the first is the short-nosed sturgeon. Now, the short-nosed sturgeon is a beautiful fish that is prehistoric. These guys are bottom feeders, and they have these bony scutes and these bony plates all across its body. They look really cool. And they were nearly extinct because of habitat restriction, river damming, and overfishing. They were listed on the endangered species list in 1967. And since then, they've created captive breeding programs. This is called mariculture. Mariculture is the breeding of fish for the fishing industry for food, or for breeding those fish, or keeping those fish alive in unnatural environments for research. And because of these captive breeding programs, they have 41 bays in North America that these species are thriving. So they were able to bring these guys back with their populations because of mariculture, with this scientific work of understanding their life cycle and being able to help those populations. The next is the brown pelican. Now, the brown pelican is a Louisiana state bird, and they were removed from the endangered species list in 1955. So that's a success. They were first placed on the endangered species list in 1970 because of the DDT crisis. Now, the DDT crisis was a really interesting event. DDT is in pesticides. It's a type of toxin, and farmers would put DDT in those pesticides and put them all over their crops to make sure that bugs did not destroy their crops. Well, because of this, the rainwater would bring them into rivers and streams, and they'd go all the way out to the ocean. And a lot of marine birds were impacted. Eagles, bald eagles, golden eagles, California condor, and pelicans as well. And what would happen is something called bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation is the accumulation of toxins through the food chain. So as those toxins are going into the ocean, they're being absorbed by phytoplankton and zooplankton. And as they're getting absorbed by the phytoplankton and zooplankton, they're getting eaten by different organisms. And as they're getting eaten by different organisms, the toxins are just absorbing and absorbing and absorbing. And for a pelican that eats fish, there's a lot of toxins that are accumulated in those fish, and it has an effect on their eggs. Whenever they're laying eggs, those eggs can be weak and they'll crack under the weight of the birds. There was a book published in 1972, actually before 1972, called The Silent Spring, and it was by Rachel Carson, and it was telling everybody a little bit about those dangers associated with unrestricted pesticide use. And DDT was federally banned in 1972, and with this, the Louisiana state bird was able to regain its population. The next is the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. Now this one again is close to home. Kemp's Ridley are the smallest species of sea turtle in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were placed on the endangered species list in 1970. Now they are still on the endangered species list, but they have received a really cool success story since 1970. So in 1970, the nest reached a all-time devastating decline, just keeping losing those number of nests. In 1985, there was a record low of 702 nests. So this decrease was because of the adult and young sea turtles being caught as bycatch. Again, we talked about bycatch, getting animals that you don't want, and then hunting those sea turtles, and then habitat loss for their nesting grounds. In the 1980s, scientists developed a turtle excluder device. We call it TED or TED. In order to release anything that's larger than the desired catch. So for shrimp, we're trying to catch shrimp. Everything that is not shrimp can actually hit these metal hula hoop type structure. The sea turtle will release out the top. There's an escape hatch that will only go with the pressure of that sea turtle and will be able to release them. That way you have the target catch in the back of that net. They also have a BRD, a bycatch reduction device. That's a small little cage on the back that will release any of the fish that can swim against that current and get out. So they have two different ways of being able to release those sea turtles from those nets. Because of this invention, the population has increased by 15% over the years because these are legally required on shrimp trawls. And if you don't have them, you also have a designated time that you can leave your nets under the water. I believe it's 25 minutes. And they've also established nesting programs and relocation programs to protect those eggs. And in 2022, there was an estimated 7,000 to 9,000 individuals. So they have experienced an increase because of these devices in place and the innovation of those scientists. The next is the flower garden banks. So this is a little bit different than an individual species. It's actually an area, and we call it a national marine sanctuary. Now there are 3 banks for the flower garden banks that are protected as a national marine sanctuary, and these banks are located 117 miles straight off from the Texas coast. Now, marine protected areas or national marine sanctuaries are areas designated as important marine ecosystems. So this can be because they're feeding grounds for endangered species like whales or great hammerhead sharks. Others contain coral reefs or kelp forest, and then some are also historic shipwrecks and other archaeological treasures that are housed within that area. So that's why sanctuaries are so important. They protect those areas, and the scientists that are kind of help designate as well, they can make those cases for those areas to be protected. The flower garden banks were discovered in the 1900s and named after their colorful reefs. And these coral reefs are nested on salt domes, and that's why they're able to survive, because those salt domes go higher into the ocean because it's right on the continental shelf and able to keep those corals close to the sun so they can use their symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae and algae. So the area has been surveyed by scientists since 1936, and it's continued even now to be surveyed by those researchers. The results from this research prompted governments to protect the banks because of oil and gas extraction, anchoring, harvesting of fish and corals and other invertebrates. They needed to be protected. This was a very specific, a very great place for those animals to live, and they didn't want to have that impacts from people. The National Marine Sanctuary Act was passed in 1972, and Scuba Diver Club, the Houston Underwater Club, was the first one. They submitted a formal letter of nomination in 1979, and it was approved in 1992. So it's kind of cool. The flower garden banks have been protected as long as I've been alive, so that's kind of a fun thing for me. But I think it's been a really cool success story because of the research we've been able to gain, and then there's a lot of that coral reef has been able, it's so far off, it's been able to be protected, and it's one of the most thriving reefs in the world. So now that we've learned about those endangered species and their successes, let's talk about conservation methods. From these successes, what methods did the scientists use? And what methods do you think can help? Feel free to pause the video and write some down if you'd like. But let's go over a couple that I've seen from trends and that we see as scientists. The first is habitat restoration, establishing protected areas, not just marine protected areas, but protected areas like state parks or national parks. Protecting biodiversity, making sure that those food chains exist and that they make sense. Hunting restrictions, like our flounder population. If flounders need to recuperate from a large year of loss, you need to restrict those days where they're able to be fished for. Managing waste, making sure that some of the things that we're producing, is it worth the waste that we're producing into the world? And then the last is research and education. Scientists need to do some research. They need to make sure that they are researching the life cycle of some of these animals. What do they need? What is the impact of things like bioaccumulation? And then education, programs like Sea Camp, where we get to teach kids about these things that are happening in the ocean. Those are all different ways that we can help protect and help spread awareness for these animals. Now, how can we help? Now, on an individual level, what are some ways that we can help? In your opinion, what seems like the biggest problem? And what obstacles might prevent those solutions? You can see we have a beautiful picture of Ocean Conservation Camp in 2019 and a habitat restoration project. And we at Sea Camp love to educate students about the ways that they can protect and conserve. And using these conservation methods, using the research that everyone has made, it allows us to be able to see these individual species, be able to make a plan, and be able to help them in their natural habitat.